Unit 2, Assessment Strategies, Methods, and Tools. 2.1, Introduction. In the previous unit you have been introduced with the major concepts of educational assessment and evaluation. You also learned about the purposes and principles of assessment. In this unit you will learn about the nature, strengths, and weaknesses of the various assessment strategies, methods and tools that can be used in the context of secondary education. You will also learn about planning, construction, and administration of classroom tests. Learning outcomes. At the end of this unit you should be able to identify relevant assessment strategies, methods and tools. Compare assessment and evaluation methods and tools to select appropriate ones. Develop formative and summative assessment tools as per the principles of assessment. Complete tasks on linking formative with summative assessment. Evaluate assessment tools by identifying relevant criteria. 2.2. Types and approaches to assessment. There are different approaches in conducting assessment in the classroom. Here we are going to see 5 pairs of assessment typologies, namely formal versus informal, criterion referenced versus norm referenced, formative versus summative assessments, divergent versus convergent, process versus product assessment. 2.2.1 Formative versus summative assessments. Assessment procedures can be classified according to their functional role during classroom instruction. One such classification system follows a sequence in which assessment procedures are likely to be used in the classroom. The most commonly referred to and used categories in this regard are formative assessment and summative assessment. Can you differentiate these concepts? Please try to describe them before you proceed studying the following section. Formative assessment. Formative assessments are used to shape and guide classroom instruction. They can include both informal and formal assessments, which will be discussed later in this section, and help us to gain a clearer picture of where our students are and what they still need help with. They can be given before, during, and even after instruction, as long as the goal is to improve instruction. Formative assessments are ongoing assessments, reviews, and observations in a classroom. They are designed to assist the learning process by providing feedback to both students and teachers. Students receive feedback that they can use to adjust, improve their performance or other aspects of their engagement in the unit, such as study techniques. For example, a language teacher may give comments on short stories composed by his or her students, but not overall marks. Teachers receive feedback on the quality of learners' understandings and consequently can modify their teaching approaches to provide enrichment or remedial activities to more effectively guide learners. For example, if a teacher observes that some students do not grasp a concept, he or she can design a review activity to reinforce the concept or use a different instructional strategy to reteach it. Teachers can conduct formative assessment at any point in a unit of study. Formative assessment is also known by the name assessment for learning. The basic idea of this concept is that the basic purpose of assessment should be to enhance students' learning. There is still another name which is associated with the concept of formative assessment: continuous assessment. Continuous assessment, as opposed to terminal assessment, is based on the premise that if assessment is to help students' improvement in their learning, and if a teacher is to determine the progress of students towards the achievement of the learning goals, it has to be conducted on a continuous basis. Thus, continuous assessment is a teaching approach as well as a process of deciding to what extent the educational objectives are actually being realized during instruction. The main advantage of continuous assessment are that both students and teachers obtain feedback from the process, which can then be used to improve the process of learning and teaching, and the final result is based on evidence gathered over the span of the learning period. In schools, continuous assessment of learning is usually carried out by teachers on the basis of impressions gained as they observe their students at work, or by various kinds of tests given periodically. Therefore, each decision is based on various types of information that are determined through different assessment methods at different times by teachers. In order to assess your students' understanding, there are various strategies that you can use. Can you mention some of the strategies that you can use to assess your students for formative purposes? Please try to mention as many strategies as you can. The following are some of the strategies of assessment you can employ in your classrooms, namely, you can make your students write their understanding of vocabulary or concepts before and after instruction. Ask students to summarize the main ideas they've taken away from your presentation, discussion, or assigned reading. Make students complete a few problems or questions at the end of instruction and check answers. Interview students individually or in groups about their thinking as they solve problems. Assign brief in-class writing assignments, e.g., why is this person or event representative of this time period in history? Tests and homework can also be used formatively. If teachers analyze where students are in their learning and provide specific, focused feedback regarding performance and ways to improve it. Summative assessment. Summative assessment typically comes at the end of a course or unit of instruction. It evaluates the quality of students' learning and assigns a mark to that student's work based on how effectively learners have addressed the performance standards and criteria. Assessment tasks conducted during the progress of a semester may be regarded as summative in nature if they only contribute to the final grades of the students. The techniques used in summative assessment are determined by the instructional goals. Typically, however, they include teacher-made achievement tests, ratings of various types of performance, and assessment of products, reports, drawings, etc. The difference between formative and summative assessment can be summarized as follows. Timing. Formative assessment conducted throughout the teaching-learning process. Summative assessment conducted at the end of a teaching-learning phases, e.g. end of semester or year. Method. Formative assessment, paper and pencil tests, observations, quizzes, exercises, practical sessions administered to the group and individually. Summative assessment, paper and pencil tests, Oral tests administered to the group. Aim: formative assessment to assess progress and recommend remedial action for non-achievement of objectives. Formative assessment, remediation, or enrichment or reteach the topic. Summative assessment, grading to determine if the program was successful. Summative assessment, to certify students and improve the curriculum. Example: formative assessment, quizzes, essays, diagnostic tests, lab reports and anecdotal records. Summative assessment, final exams, national examinations, qualifying tests. A particular assessment task can be both formative and summative. For example, students could complete Unit 1 of their module and complete an assessment task for which they earned a mark that counted towards their final grade. In this sense, the task is summative. They could also receive extensive feedback on their work. Such feedback would guide learners to achieve higher levels of performance in subsequent tasks. In this sense, the task is formative because it helps students form different approaches and strategies to improve their performance in the future. 2.2.2 Formal versus informal assessment. Assessment can also be either formal or informal. Let us try to understand their differences in the paragraphs that follow. Formal assessment. Formal assessments are where the students are aware that the task they are doing is for assessment purposes. They are frequently used in summative assessments. This usually implies a written document, such as a test, quiz, or paper. A formal assessment is given a numerical score, or grade based on student performance. We will deal more on formal assessment strategies, particularly on tests in a later section. Informal assessment, informal, is used here to indicate techniques that can easily be incorporated into classroom routines and learning activities. Informal assessment techniques can be used at any time without interfering with instructional time. Their results are indicative of the student's performance on the skill or subject of interest. Thus, they are more frequently used in formative assessments. Can you think of the informal assessment strategies that you can use in your classes? What informal assessment strategies have your teachers used when you were a student? An informal assessment usually occurs in a more casual manner and may include observation, inventories, checklists, rating scales, rubrics, performance and portfolio assessments, participation, peer and self-evaluation, and discussion. Formal tests assume a single set of expectations for all students and come with prescribed criteria for scoring and interpretation. Informal assessment, on the other hand, requires a clear understanding of the levels of ability the students bring with them. Only then may assessment activities be selected that students can attempt reasonably. Informal assessment seeks to identify the strengths and needs of individual students without regard to grade or age norms. Methods for informal assessment can be divided into two main types: unstructured, e.g., student work samples, journals, and structured, e.g., checklists, observations. The unstructured methods frequently are somewhat more difficult to score and evaluate, but they can provide a great deal of valuable information about the skills of the students. Structured methods can be reliable and valid techniques when time is spent creating the scoring procedures. Another important aspect of informal assessments is that they actively involve the students in the evaluation process. They are not just paper and pencil tests. 2.2.3 Criterion referenced versus norm referenced assessments. How the results of tests and other assessment procedures are interpreted also provides a method of classifying these instruments. There are two ways of interpreting student performance: criterion referenced and norm referenced. Criterion referenced assessment. This type of assessment allows us to quantify the extent to which students have achieved the goals of a unit of study in a course. It is carried out against previously specified criteria and performance standards. Where a grade is assigned, it is assigned on the basis of the standard the student has achieved in each of the criteria. This type of assessment is most appropriate for quickly assessing what concepts and skills students have learned from a segment of instruction. Criterion referenced classrooms are mastery-oriented, informing all students of the expected standard and teaching them to succeed on related outcome measures. Criterion referenced assessments help to eliminate competition and may improve cooperation. In criterion referenced evaluation, a student's achievement is compared against a specified criterion or standard or according to prescribed curriculum goals. If a teacher's main interest is to pinpoint how well students have mastered a particular skill, the most appropriate form of assessment may be criterion referenced assessment. Norm referenced assessment. This type of assessment has as its endpoint the determination of student performance based on a position within a cohort of students, the norm group. This type of assessment is most appropriate when one wishes to make comparisons across large numbers of students, or important decisions regarding student placement and advancement. For example, students' results in grade 8 national exams in our country are determined based on their relative standing in comparison to all other students who have taken the exam. Thus, when we say that a student has scored 80 percentile, it doesn't mean that the student has scored an average of 80% score. Rather, it is meant to be that the student's average score stands above 79.9% of the students, and the remaining 20% of students have scored above that particular student. Students' assignment of ranks is also another example of norm-referenced interpretation of students' performances. The focus of attention in this type of assessment is on how well the student has done on a test in comparison with other students. To summarize, the criterion-referenced assessment emphasizes description of students' performance, and the norm-referenced assessment emphasizes discrimination among individual students in terms of relative level of learning. 2.2.4 Divergent versus convergent assessment. Divergent assessments are those for which a range of answers or solutions might be considered correct. For example, a civics teacher might ask his or her students to compare presidential and parliamentary forms of government as preferable forms of government for a country. A student might favor a presidential form of government by providing sound arguments and valid examples. Another student also might come up with still convincing ideas favoring parliamentary form of government. In both cases, the answers are different but convincingly correct. So in divergent assessments there might not be one single answer. Divergent assessment tools include essay tests and solutions to the workout problems. A convergent assessment are those which have only one correct response that the student is trying to reach. They are generally easier to mark. They tend to be quicker to deliver and give more specific and directed feedback to individuals. It can also provide wide curriculum coverage. Objective test items are the best example and demonstrate the value of this approach in assessing knowledge. 2.2.5 Process versus product assessment. Process assessment focuses on the steps or procedures underlying a particular ability or task. This means the cognitive steps in performing a mathematical operation or the procedure involved in analyzing a blood sample. Because it provides more detailed information, process assessment is most useful when a student is learning a new skill, and for providing formative feedback to assist in improving performance. For example, a biology teacher teaching his students how to identify a microorganism using a microscope might give them a task to do an activity. Here his/focus is not only on whether students are able to identify the microorganism. He should also check on whether students have followed the proper procedures to reach the conclusion. Product assessment focuses on evaluating the result or outcome of a process. Using the above examples, we would focus on the answer to the math computation or the accuracy of the blood test results. Product assessment is most appropriate for documenting proficiency or competency in a given skill. A multiple choice test that a mathematics teacher gives to his students, for example, is a product assessment. There is no way he or she will check whether students have followed the proper procedures to get the correct answer. 2.3 Assessment strategies. Assessment strategy refers to those assessment tasks, methods, approaches, activities in which students are engaged to ensure that all the learning objectives of a subject, a unit or a lesson have been adequately addressed. Assessment strategies range from informal, almost unconscious, observation to formal examinations. Although different subject areas may have some differences on the assessment strategies they use, generally, however, there are varieties of methods that can be used by most subjects. When selecting assessment strategies in our subject areas, there are a number of things that we have to consider. First and foremost, it is important that we choose an assessment technique appropriate for the particular behavior being assessed. We have to use a strategy that can give students an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of behavior that the learning outcome demands. Assessment strategies should also be related to the course material and relevant to students' lives. Therefore, we have to provide assessment strategies that relate to students' future work. There are many different ways to categorize learning goals for students. One way in which the different learning outcomes that we want our students to develop can be categorized is presented as follows: knowledge and understanding, What facts do students know outright? What information can they retrieve? What do they understand? Reasoning proficiency. Can students analyze, categorize, and sort into component parts? Can they generalize and synthesize what they have learned? Can they evaluate and justify the worth of a process or decision? Skills. We have certain skills that we want students to master, such as reading fluently, working productively in a group, making an oral presentation, speaking a foreign language, or designing an experiment. Ability to create products. Another kind of learning target is student-created products, tangible evidence that the student has mastered knowledge, reasoning, and specific production skills. Examples include a research paper, a piece of furniture, or artwork. Dispositions. We also frequently care about student attitudes and habits of mind, including attitudes towards school, persistence, responsibility, flexibility, and desire to learn. Activity. In groups, discuss and identify the assessment strategies that you consider are best for assessing each of these categories of learning goals, and compare your work with that of other groups. From among the various assessment strategies that can be used by classroom teachers, some are described below for your consideration as student teachers. Classroom presentations. A classroom presentation is an assessment strategy that requires students to verbalize their knowledge, select and present samples of finished work, and organize their thoughts about a topic in order to present a summary of their learning. It may provide the basis for assessment upon completion of a student's project or essay. For example, students may present a report after an educational visit. What other educational activities can you imagine in your subject area, where students can present their works? Conferences. A conference is a formal or informal meeting between the teacher and a student for the purpose of exchanging information or sharing ideas. A conference might be held to explore the student's thinking and suggest next steps, assess the student's level of understanding of a particular concept or procedure, and review, clarify, and extend what the student has already completed. What advantages do you think conference as a method of assessment will have? Exhibitions or demonstrations. An exhibition/demonstration is a performance in a public setting during which a student explains and applies a process, procedure, etc. in concrete ways to show individual achievement of specific skills and knowledge. What type of objectives do you think this assessment strategy could serve to measure? Interviews. You should be familiar with the interviews journalists conduct with different personalities. An interview can also be used for assessment purposes in educational settings. In such applications, interview is a face-to-face conversation in which teacher and student use inquiry to share their knowledge and understanding of a topic or problem. This form of assessment can be used by the teacher to explore the student's thinking, assess the student's level of understanding of a concept or procedure, and gather information, obtain clarification, determine positions, and probe for motivations. Observation. Observation is a process of systematically viewing and recording students while they work, for the purpose of making instruction decisions. Observation can take place at any time and in any setting. It provides information on students' strengths and weaknesses, learning styles, interests, and attitudes. Observations may be informal or highly structured, and incidental or scheduled over different periods of time in different learning contexts. Performance tasks. During a performance task, students create, produce, perform, or present works on real-world issues. The performance task may be used to assess a skill or proficiency, and provides useful information on the process as well as the product. Please mention some examples of performance tasks that students can do in your subject area. Portfolios. A portfolio is a collection of samples of a student's work over time. It offers a visual demonstration of a student's achievement, capabilities, strengths, weaknesses, knowledge, and specific skills over time and in a variety of contexts. For a portfolio to serve as an effective assessment instrument, it has to be focused, selective, reflective, and collaborative. Portfolios can be prepared for different subjects in any educational level. What type of materials can be included in the portfolio of students in relation to your subject? Attention! At this point of your study, you will be required to start filing samples of your work, those that are indicated as part of your portfolio, to serve as evidence of your performance on this course. Questions and answers, perhaps. This is a widely used strategy by teachers with the intention of involving their students in the learning and teaching process. In this strategy, the teacher poses a question and the student answers verbally, rather than in writing. This strategy helps the teacher to determine whether students understand what is being, or has been, presented. It also helps students to extend their thinking, generate ideas, or solve problems. Strategies for effective question and answer assessment include: apply a wait time or no hands-up rule, to provide students with time to think after a question before they are called upon randomly to respond. Ask a variety of questions, including open-ended questions and those that require more than right or wrong answer. During what time of the lesson do you think question and answer strategy will be more useful? Why? Students' self-assessments. Self-assessment is a process by which the student gathers information about and reflects on his or her own learning. It is the student's own assessment of personal progress in terms of knowledge, skills, processes, or attitudes. Self-assessment leads students to a greater awareness and understanding of themselves as learners. Checklists, rating scales and rubrics. These are tools that state specific criteria and allow teachers and students to gather information and to make judgments about what students know and can do in relation to the outcomes. They offer systematic ways of collecting data about specific behaviors, knowledge and skills. Checklists usually offer a yes/no format in relation to student demonstration of specific criteria. They may be used to record observations of an individual, a group, or a whole class. Rating scales allow teachers to indicate the degree or frequency of the behaviors, skills, and strategies displayed by the learner. Rating scales state the criteria and provide 3 or 4 response selections to describe the quality or frequency of student work. Rubrics use a set of criteria to evaluate a student's performance. They consist of a fixed measurement scale and detailed description of the characteristics for each level of performance. These descriptions focus on the quality of the product or performance and not the quantity. Rubrics use a set of specific criteria to evaluate student performance. They may be used to assess individuals or groups and, as with rating scales, may be compared over time. The purpose of checklists, rating scales and rubrics is to provide tools for systematic recording of observations, provide tools for self-assessment, provide samples of criteria for students prior to collecting and evaluating data on their work, record the development of specific skills, strategies, attitudes and behaviors necessary for demonstrating learning, clarify students' instructional needs by presenting a record of current accomplishments. In what specific instances can these assessment strategies, rating scales, checklists and rubrics used in your area of study? Think of specific examples and share your ideas with your colleague. 1-minute paper. During the last few minutes of the class period, you may ask students to answer on a half sheet of paper, what is the most important point you learned today, and what point remains least clear to you. The purpose is to obtain data about students' comprehension of a particular class session. Then you can review responses and note any useful comments. During the next class periods, you can emphasize the issues illuminated by your students' comments. Muddy is point. This is similar to 1-minute paper, but only asks students to describe what they didn't understand and what they think might help. It is an important technique that will help you to determine which key points of the lesson were missed by the students. Here also you have to review before next class meeting and use to clarify, correct, or elaborate. Student-generated test questions. You may allow students to write test questions and model answers for specified topics in a format consistent with course exams. This will give students the opportunity to evaluate the course topics, reflect on what they understand, and what good test items are. You may evaluate the questions and use the good ones as prompts for discussion. Tests. This is the type of assessment that you are mostly familiar with. A test requires students to respond to prompts in order to demonstrate their knowledge orally or in writing, or their skills, e.g., through performance. We will learn much more about tests later in this section. Activity. Let's say you need to assess student achievement on each of the following learning targets. Which assessment strategy would you choose? Please jot down your answers with their justifications and file it in your portfolio for later reference. 1. Ability to write clearly and coherently. 2. Group discussion proficiency. 3. Reading comprehension. 4. Proficiency using specified mathematical procedures. 5. Proficiency conducting investigations in science. 2.4. Assessment in large classes. It is quite obvious that student numbers in a class limit the teaching methods available to teachers. Similarly, assessment methods are restricted by class size. Due to time and resources constraints, teachers often use less time-demanding assessment methods which, however, may not always optimize student learning. Activity: what problems do you think teachers will face when assessing students in large classes? In your school years, what problems have you observed in assessment as a result of a large class size? Please discuss on these questions in groups. The existing educational literature has identified various assessment issues associated with large classes. They include a common service learning approach. Traditionally, teachers rely on time-efficient and exam-based assessment methods for assessing large classes, such as multiple choices and short-answer question examinations. These assessments often only assess learning at the lower levels of intellectual complexity. Furthermore, students tend to adopt a service road learning approach when preparing for these kinds of assessment methods. Higher-level learning such as critical thinking and analysis are often not fully assessed. Feedback is often inadequate. Feedback plays an important role in the learning process of students, particularly if students can receive feedback at an early stage of their learning process. This will help them identify their own problems and improve their learning. However, with a large class, teachers may not have time to give detailed and constructive feedback to every student. Most teachers usually can only afford to give general feedback to their students on written assignments and tests. See inconsistency in marking. Large class usually consists of a diverse and complex group of students. The issues of different perception towards assessments, cultural and educational background, prior knowledge and level of interest to the subject all pose challenges to the fairness of marking and grading. Teachers have to take all these into account in order to ensure the consistency and fairness in marking and grading. Difficulty in monitoring cheating and plagiarism. Plagiarism is another challenge in assessing large classes. Some students deliberately cheat in large classes because they think that they are less likely to be identified within a large group. In addition, as teachers usually have a heavy workload and tight marking schedule, they do not have enough time to thoroughly check the work submitted by their students. To minimize plagiarism, assessment tasks must be well thought and well designed. Lack of interaction and engagement. Students are often not motivated to engage in a large-sized lecture. When teachers raise questions in large classes, not many students are willing to respond. Students are less likely to interact with teachers because they feel less motivated and tend to hide themselves in a large group. In fact, interacting with students in class is important for teachers because they can receive immediate feedback from students regarding their quality of teaching. Although these issues can be problems in assessment for any class size, they are worse in large classes because of the additional limitation and strain on resources. They are problems that are applicable whether the function of the assessment is to facilitate learning via feedback or to classify students via grading. There are a number of ways to make the assessment of large numbers of students more effective, while still supporting effective student learning. These include 1. Front-ending. The basic idea of this strategy is that by putting in an increased effort at the beginning, in setting up the students for the work they are going to do, the work submitted can be improved. Therefore, the time needed to market is reduced, as well as time being saved in less requests for tutorial guidance. 2. Making use of in-class assignments. In-class assignments are usually quick and therefore relatively easy to mark and provide feedback on, and help you to identify gaps in understanding. Students could be asked to complete a task within the time frame of a scheduled lecture, field exercise, or practical class. This might be a very quick task, for example, completing a graph, doing some calculations, answering some quick questions, making brief notes on a piece of text, etc. In some cases it might be possible to merge the in-class assignment with peer assessment. 3. Self and peer assessment. Students can perform a variety of assessment tasks in ways which both save the tutor's time and bring educational benefits, especially the development of their own judgment skills. These include self-assessment and peer assessment strategies. Self-assessment reduces the marking load because it ensures a higher quality of work is submitted, thereby minimizing the amount of time expended on marking and feedback. The emphasis on student self-assessment represents a fundamental shift in the teacher-student relationship, placing the primary responsibility for learning with the student. However, there are problems involved in self-assessment for grading purposes pertaining to their validity and reliability. If self-assessment is utilized for the purposes of grading, it is imperative to employ peer or staff cross-marking to ensure the validity of the results. Self-assessment should also be confined to certain limited objectives, such as ascertaining whether all of the required components of an answer are present, or the articulation of very transparent assessment criteria and standards, possibly accompanied by examples of work of varying standards. In this regard, self-assessment can decrease the marking load of teachers and provide students with a positive learning experience by compelling them to examine their work from the perspective of a marker as well as a participant. Similar to self-assessment, peer assessment provides useful learning experiences for students at the same time as reducing the marking load of staff. The use of peer assessment can be an effective way for ensuring a student gets individual feedback that staff may be very busy to provide in a timely manner given the class numbers involved. This could involve providing students with answer sheets or model answers to a piece of coursework that you had set previously, and then requiring students to undertake the marking of those assignments in class. For example, you can ask students to exchange works with one another or collect in all of the named works and randomly assign student markers to them. However, as with any form of peer assessment, it needs to be carefully designed. Students need to know what to do, and there needs to be a transparent system by which students can appeal their marks, especially if used in a summative rather than formative context. The benefits of this approach are that Students can get to see how their peers have tackled a particular piece of work. They can see how you would assess the work, e.g. from the model answers/answer sheets you've provided, and they are put in the position of being an assessor, thereby giving them an opportunity to internalize the assessment criteria. 4. Group assessments. The most obvious advantage of group-based assessment is that it significantly reduces the marking load. If the group submits only one piece of assessable work, the major problem, of course, is that group members may not contribute equally, so how are they to be rewarded fairly? There is probably no easy solution to this, but there is a range of possible strategies which may go at least some way to addressing the problem. 5. Changing the assessment method, or at least shortening it. Being faced with large numbers of students will present challenges, but may also provide opportunities to either modify existing assessments or to explore new methods of assessment. You might, for example, be able to reduce the length of the assessment task you're currently using without detracting from your module's learning outcomes. Alternatively, a large class may provide a new opportunity to make use of peer and self-assessment. Assignment: visit any one of the schools in your vicinity and interview at least 3 teachers in your subject area using questions you have prepared for the purpose. The questions should be related to the problems they have faced in assessing students in large classes, and to the strategies they have used to tackle the problems. Based on the information you have collected, prepare a report of 1-2 pages. You have to file the report as part of your portfolio. 2.5. Selecting and developing assessment methods and tools. One of the most difficult tasks for most teachers is assessing the performance of their students, determining to what extent each individual student has attained the level of mastery defined by the course outcomes. Students' learning behaviors will be determined by the examinations you administer. If your goal is to establish an active learning environment in which students are expected to learn the facts and learn to apply them, but your exams assess only the student's ability to recite memorized facts, you will have made it unlikely that the students will engage in meaningful learning. Thus, the assessment tools that you employ in your subject area have an enormously important role in determining how and what students will learn. Thus, the process of assessing student performance in your subject area must begin with a close look at your educational outcomes. What you will discover is that some outcomes are relatively easy to assess, while other outcomes are very much harder to test. Activity: list all of the forms of assessment that you have experienced during your school years. Are there other approaches to assessment with which you are familiar, even if you haven't personally experienced them as a student? A wide variety of tools are available for assessing student performance, and there are approaches that are suitable for any educational objective you want to test. Examples include objective exams, short answer and essay exams, portfolios, projects, practical exams, presentations, and combinations of these. Appropriate tools or combinations of tools must be selected and used if the assessment process is to successfully provide information relevant to stated educational outcomes. 2.5.1 Selecting appropriate assessment methods and tools. When selecting and constructing assessment tools, it is very important that we consider the following questions. Does the assessment adequately evaluate academic performance relevant to the desired outcome? Does this assessment tool enable students with different learning styles or abilities to show you what they have learned and what they can do? Does the content examined by the assessment align with the content from the course? Does this assessment method adequately address the knowledge, skills, abilities, behavior, and values associated with the intended outcome? Will the assessment provide information at a level appropriate to the outcome? Will the data accurately represent what the student can do in an authentic or real-life situation? Does the assessment provide data that is specific enough for the desired outcomes? Are the intended uses for the assessment clear? Will the information derived from the assessment help to improve teaching and learning? Characteristics of a good assessment tools. Good assessment at any level is characterized by the following features. 1. Clear and appropriate learning targets. What do we want to assess? What knowledge, skills, reasoning ability, products, and habits of mind are essential for student success? Do students understand what is expected of them? Is the knowledge or skill that students are expected to demonstrate for the assessment influenced by cultural and linguistic issues? 2. Clearly focused and appropriate purpose. Why are we assessing? How will the assessment information be used? By whom? To make what decisions? Will the cultural and linguistic traits of the user interfere with the intended purpose of the assessment? 3. Appropriate match among targets, purposes, and method of assessment. How will we assess the targeted learning? Which methods of assessment are most appropriate for each kind of target? Is the method used to address each target designed with consideration of the cultural and linguistic traits of the students? 4. Sufficient sampling of student work to make sound inferences about learning. How much will we collect? Do we have enough varied samples of student work to make good judgments about current proficiency related to the target learning? Have we chosen sufficient and varied assessment examples that allow the students to take advantage of their cultural and linguistic strengths? 5. Fairness and freedom from biases that distort the picture of learning. How accurate are the assessments? Do they really assess what we think they're assessing? Is there anything about the way a target is assessed that masks the true learning of a student or group of students? Do we know the strengths that students bring to learning and use those strengths in our assessments? 2.5.2 Planning tests. Tests are one of the most important and commonly used assessment instruments used in education. The development of valid, reliable and usable questions involves proper planning. The plan entails designing a framework that can guide the test developers in the item's development process. This is necessary because classroom test is a key factor in the evaluation of learning outcomes. The validity, reliability, and usability of such test depend on the care with which the tests are planned and prepared. Planning helps to ensure that the test covers the pre-specified instructional objectives and the subject matter content under consideration. Hence, planning classroom test involves identifying the instructional objectives earlier stated and the subject matter content covered during the teaching/learning process. This leads to the preparation of table of specification, the test blueprint for the test, while bearing in mind the type of test that would be relevant for the purpose of testing. To plan a classroom test that will be both practical and effective in providing evidence of mastery of the instructional objectives and content covered requires relevant considerations. Hence, the following serves as guide in planning a classroom test. I determine the purpose of the test. I describe the instructional objectives and content to be measured. Determine the relative emphasis to be given to each learning outcome. Select the most appropriate item, formats, essay or objective. Develop the test blueprint to guide the test construction. Prepare test items that is relevant to the learning outcomes specified in the test plan. Decide on the pattern of scoring and the interpretation of result. Decide on the length and duration of the test. And assemble the items into a test. Prepare direction and administer the test. The instructional objectives of the course are critically considered while developing the test items. This is because the instructional objectives are the intended behavioral changes or intended learning outcomes of instructional programs which students are expected to possess at the end of the instructional process. The objectives are also given relative weight in respect to the level of importance and emphasis given to them. Educational objectives and the content of a course are the focus on which test development is based. I hope you remember from our brief discussion in Chapter 1 about how educational objectives are classified. Table of specification. A table of specification is a two-way table that matches the objectives and content you have taught with the level at which you expect your students to perform. It contains an estimate of the percentage of the test to be associated to each topic at each level at which it is to be measured. In effect, we establish how much emphasis to give to each objective or content. A table of specification guides the selection of test items, which in effect ensures that the test measures a representative sample of instructionally relevant tasks. Developing a table of specification involves 1. Preparing a list of learning outcomes, i.e. the type of performance students are expected to demonstrate. 2. Outlining the contents of instruction, i.e. the area in which each type of performance is to be shown. And 3. Preparing the two-way chart that relates the learning outcomes to the instructional content. Now, let us try to understand how a test blueprint is developed using the following table. Page 45 of specification developed for a geography test as an example. As can be observed from the table, the rows show the content areas from which the test is to be sampled, and the columns indicate the level of thinking students are required to demonstrate in each of the content areas. Thus, the test items are distributed among each of the 5 content areas with their corresponding representation among the 6 levels of the cognitive domain. The percentage row and column also show the degree of representation of both the contents and levels of the cognitive domain in this particular test. The subjectives you consider are more important should get more representation in the test items. Similarly, content areas on which you have spent more instructional time should be allotted more test items. Which of the objectives on the example above were given more emphasis? Which of them obtained least emphasis? Which content areas obtained the highest representation? Which one obtained the last representation? What are the implications of these differences? There are also other ways of developing a test blueprint. One of this is a way of showing the distribution of test items among the content areas and the type of test items to be developed from each content area. For example, the table of specification that we have seen earlier can be prepared in the following way on page 46. 2.5.3 Constructing classroom tests. There are a wide variety of styles and formats for writing test items. One commonly used distinction is between paper and pencil tests, performance assessments, and oral tests. Paper and pencil tests are the traditional assessment techniques, where students are required to respond to a set of questions in writing. Performance assessment tasks, also called authentic assessments, require the student to use equipment, generate hypotheses, make observations, construct something, or perform for an audience. For most performance assessment tasks, there is not a single best or right response. Expert judgment is required to score the performances. Oral test refers to verbal communication between examiner and testee. The candidate is required to respond orally instead of in writing. In this section you will learn about test construction techniques. Before we deal with this issue, however, the general principles that should be followed in test construction will be presented. General principles of test construction. Assessment is a critical component of instruction, and with careful use can assist in achieving curricular goals. Considering the powerful effects of assessments, it is very important that testing tools should be carefully chosen and formulated to provide constructive feedback to the students and teachers about students' competence and deficiencies. However, writing high-quality test questions is not an easy task. Following are some general principles that we should consider when constructing written test items. 1. Make the instructions for each type of question simple and brief. 2. Use simple and clear language in the questions. If the language is difficult, students who understand the material but who do not have strong language skills may find it difficult to demonstrate their knowledge. If the language is ambiguous, even a student with strong language skills may answer incorrectly if his or her interpretation of the question differs from the instructor's intended meaning. 3. Write items that require specific understanding or ability developed in that subject. 4. Do not suggest the answer to one question in the body of another question. This makes the test less useful, as the test-wise student will have an advantage. Your colleagues should be able to provide the correct response to the questions. If correct answer can be given by only the question writer and other teachers of the same level, cannot achieve the passing marks, it indicates that either the pieces of information being asked will never be used by the learner, or the question is framed in an ambiguous manner, or is too difficult. Be constructing objective test items. There are various types of objective test items. These can be classified into those that require the student to supply the answer, supply type items, and those that require the student to select the answer from a given set of alternative selection type items. Supply type items include completion items and short answer questions. Selection type test items include true/false, multiple choice and matching. Each type of test has its unique characteristics, uses, advantages, limitations, and rules for construction. Activity 1. Students, you have taken tests with different types of formats: multiple choice test items, true/false test items, short answer test items, etc. Which of these test items did you feel more comfortable with? What are your reasons? Write down your answers and compare it with that of your friends. 2. In groups, discuss the advantages and limitations of the different types of test items. Present the results of your discussion to the whole class. A. True/false test items. I am quite sure that you are familiar with true/false test items, and therefore it may not be necessary to describe what it is. Therefore, I will focus on the characteristics of such type of test items and present you with some guidelines that can help in constructing better true/false items. The main advantage of true/false items is that they do not require the student much time for answering. This allows a teacher to cover a wide range of content by using a large number of such items. In addition, true/false test items can be scored quickly, reliably, and objectively by anybody using an answer key. The major disadvantage of true/false items is that when they are used exclusively, they tend to promote memorization of factual information, names, dates, definitions, and so on. Some argue that another weakness of true/false items is that they encourage students for guessing. This is because any student who takes such type of tests does have a 50% probability of getting the right answer. In addition, true/false items can often lead a teacher to write ambiguous statements due to the difficulty of writing statements which are clearly true or false. Do not discriminate between students of varying ability, as well as other test items can often include more irrelevant clues than do other item types, can often lead a teacher to favor testing of trivial knowledge. The following suggestions might perhaps help teachers to construct good quality true/false test items. Avoid negative statements and never use double negatives. In right, wrong, or true/false items, negatively phrased statements make it needlessly difficult for students to decide whether that statement is accurate or inaccurate. Restrict single-item statements to single concepts. If you double up two concepts in a single-item statement, how does a student respond if one concept is accurate and the other isn't? Take a look at this confusing item. Use an approximately equal number of items, reflecting the two categories tested. If you typically overbook on false items in your true/false tests, students who are totally at sea about an item will be apt to opt for a false answer, and will probably be correct. Make statements representing both categories equal in length. Again, to avoid giving away the correct answers, don't make all your false statements brief, and in an effort to include necessary qualifiers, make all your true statements long. Students catch on quickly to this kind of test-making tendency. B. Matching items. A matching item consists of two lists of words or phrases. The test taker must match components in one list, the premises, typically presented on the left, with components in the other list, the responses, typically presented on the right, according to a particular kind of association indicated in the item's directions. Like true-false items, matching items can cover a good deal of content in an efficient fashion. They are a good choice if you are interested in finding out if your students have memorized factual information. Matching items sometimes can work well if you want your students to cross-reference and integrate their knowledge regarding the listed premises and responses. The major advantage of matching items is its compact form, which makes it possible to measure a large amount of related factual material in a relatively short time. Another advantage is its ease of construction. The main limitation of matching test items is that they are restricted to the measurement of factual information based on rote learning. Another limitation is the difficulty of finding homogeneous material that is significant from the perspective of the learning outcomes. As a result, test constructors tend to include in their matching items material which is less significant. The following suggestions are important guidelines for the construction of good matching items. Use fairly brief lists, placing the shorter entries on the right. If the premises and responses in a matching item are too long, students tend to lose track of what they originally set out to look for. The words and phrases that make up the premises should be short, and those that make up the responses should be shorter still. Employ homogeneous lists. Both the list of premises and responses must be composed of similar sorts of things. If not, an alert student will be able to come up with the correct associations simply by elimination, because some entries in the premises or responses may clearly be noticeable from the others. Include more responses than premises. If you use the exact same number of responses as premises in a matching item, then a student who knows half or more of the correct associations is in a position to guess the rest of the associations with very good chances. List responses in a logical order. This rule is designed to make sure you don't accidentally give away hints about which responses connect with which premises. Choose a logical ordering scheme for your responses, say alphabetical or chronological, and stick with it. Describe the basis for matching, and the number of times a response can be used. To satisfy this rule, you need to make sure your test's directions clarify the nature of the associations you want students to use when they identify matches. Regarding the student's use of responses, a phrase such as the following is often employed. Each response in the list at the right may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Try to place all premises and responses for any matching item on a single page. This rule's intent is to free your students from lots of potentially confusing flipping back and forth in order to accurately link responses to premises. Arrange the list of responses in logical order. Place words in alphabetical order and numbers in sequence. This will contribute to the ease with which the students can scan the responses in searching for the correct answers. It will also prevent them from detecting possible clues from the arrangement of the responses. See Short answer/completion test items. The short answer items and completion test items are essentially the same, that can be answered by a word, phrase, number or formula. They differ in the way the problem is presented. The short answer type uses a direct question, whereas the completion test item consists of an incomplete statement requiring the student to complete. This can be demonstrated by the following examples. Short answer item: in which year did the Ethiopians defeat the Italian invaders at Adwa? Completion item: the Ethiopian forces defeated the Italian invaders at Adwa in the year. The short answer test items are one of the easiest to construct, partly because of the relatively simple learning outcomes it usually measures. Except for the problem-solving outcomes measured in mathematics and science, it is used almost exclusively to measure the recall of memorized information. A more important advantage of the short answer item is that the students must supply the answer. This reduces the possibility that students will obtain the correct answer by guessing. They must either recall the information requested or make the necessary computations to solve the problem presented to them. Partial knowledge, which might enable them to choose the correct answer on a selection item, is insufficient for answering a short answer test item correctly. There are two limitations cited in the use of short answer test items. One is that they are unsuitable for assessing complex learning outcomes. The other is the difficulty of scoring. This is especially true where the item is not clearly phrased to require a definitely correct answer and the student's spelling ability. The following suggestions will help to make short answer type test items to function as intended. Word the item so that the required answer is both brief and specific. Example: an animal that eats the flesh of other animals is dash. Poorly stated: an animal that eats the flesh of other animals is classified as dash. Better item: do not take statements directly from textbooks to use as a basis for short answer items. When taken out of context, such statements are frequently too general and ambiguous to serve as good short answer items. A direct question is generally more desirable than an incomplete statement. If the answer is to be expressed in numerical units, indicate the type of answer wanted. For computational problems, it is usually preferable to indicate the units in which the answer is to be expressed. D. Multiple choice items. This is the most popular type of selected response item. It can effectively measure many of the simple learning outcomes measured by the short answer item, the true-false item, and the matching item types. In addition, it can measure a variety of complex cognitive learning outcomes. A multiple-choice item consists of 3 stems that poses the problem and a list of suggested solutions. A student is first given either a question or a partially complete statement. This part of the item is referred to as the item stem. Then 3 or more potential answer options are presented. These are usually called alternatives, choices or options. The correct response is called the key answer. The remaining alternatives are called distractors. There are 2 important variants in a multiple choice item. 1. Whether the stem consists of a direct question or an incomplete statement. And 2. Whether the student's choice of alternatives is supposed to be a correct answer or a best answer. The following 2 examples will demonstrate their differences. A direct question or best answer multiple choice item. Which of the following European countries has suffered more from the consequences of the Second World War? A. Germany, B. Britain, C. France, D. Russia or us. An incomplete statement. Correct answer multiple choice item. The Second World War was started in the year A. 1936, B. 1939, C. 1941, D. 1945. A key advantage of the multiple choice item is its widespread applicability to the assessment of cognitive skills and knowledge, as well as to the measurement of students' effect. Another advantage of multiple choice items is that it's possible to make them quite varied in the levels of difficulty they possess. Cleverly constructed multiple choice items can present very high-level cognitive challenges to students. And, of course, as with all selected response items, multiple choice items are fairly easy to score. The key weakness of multiple choice items is that, when students review a set of alternatives for an item, they may be able to recognize a correct answer that they would never have been able to generate on their own. In that sense, multiple choice items can present an exaggerated picture of a student's understanding or competence, which might lead teachers to invalid inferences. Another serious weakness, one shared by all selected response items, is that multiple choice items can never measure a student's ability to creatively synthesize content of any sort. Finally, in an effort to come up with the necessary number of plausible alternatives, novice item writers sometimes toss in some alternatives that are obviously incorrect. The general applicability and the superior qualities of multiple choice test items are realized well when care is taken in their construction. This involves formulating a clearly stated problem, identifying plausible alternatives, and avoiding irrelevant clues to the answer. The following are more specific suggestions for the construction of good multiple choice items. The question or problem in the stem must be self-contained. The stem should contain as much of the item's content as possible, thereby rendering the alternatives much shorter than would otherwise be the case. Avoid negatively stated stems. Just as with the true/false items, negatively stated stems can create genuine confusion in students. Each alternative must be grammatically consistent with the item's stem. Well, as you can see from the next sample item, grammatical inconsistency for 3 of these answer options supplies students with an unintended clue to the correct answer. Make all alternatives plausible, but be sure that one of them is indisputably the correct or best answer. As I indicated when describing the weaknesses of multiple choice items, teachers sometimes toss in one or more implausible alternatives, thereby diminishing the item substantially. Although avoiding that problem is important, it's even more important to make certain that you really do have one valid correct answer in any item's list of alternatives, rather than two similar answers, either of which could be arguably correct. Randomly use all answer positions in approximately equal numbers. If you use 4 option items, make sure that roughly 1/4 of the correct answers turn out to be A, 1/4 B, and so on. Never use all of the above as an answer choice, but use none of the above to make items more demanding. Students often become confused when confronted with items that have more than one correct answer. Usually, what happens is they'll see one correct alternative and instantly opt for it without recognizing that there are other correct options later in the list. In addition, students will definitely opt for the all of the above option if they realize that 2 of the alternatives are correct without considering the third option. However, we can increase the difficulty level of a test item by presenting 3 or 4 answer options, none of which is correct, followed by correct none of the above option. Verbal associations between the stem and the correct answer should be avoided. Frequently, a word in the correct answer will provide an irrelevant clue because it looks or sounds like a word in the stem of the item. The relative length of the alternatives should not provide a clue to the answer, since the correct alternative usually needs to be qualified. It tends to be longer than the distractors, unless a special effort is made to control the length of the alternatives. In addition, it is to consider the following suggestions. Design each item to measure an important learning outcome. Eliminate unnecessary wordiness. All options should be homogeneous. Make all options grammatically consistent with the stem of the item. Order options logically. Activity. Examine the following faulty multiple choice items and identify their problems. Point 1. The term side effect of a drug refers to A. Additional benefits from the drug, B. The chain effect of drug action, C. The influence of drugs on crime, D. Any action of a drug in the body other than the one the doctor wanted the drug to have. 2. When linking 2 clauses, one main and one subordinate, one should use a coordinate conjunction such as and or so, B. Subordinate conjunction such as because or although, C. Prepositions such as to or from, D. semicolon. 3. Entomologies. A. The study of birds, B. The study of fish, C. The study of insects. 4. The promiscuous use of sprays, oils, and antiseptics in the nose during acute colds is a pernicious practice because it may have a deleterious effect on A. The sinuses, B. Red blood cells, C. White blood cells. 5. An electric transformer can be used, A. For storing electricity, B. To increase the voltage of alternating current, C. It converts electric energy in mechanical energy, D. Alternating current is changed to direct current, B. Constructing say or subjective test items. In the previous paragraphs you have been learning on how objective tests should be constructed. You have learned that well-constructed objective tests can measure a variety of learning outcomes, from simple to complex. Despite this wide applicability of such type of tests, there remain significant learning outcomes for which no satisfactory objective measurements have been developed. These include such outcomes as the ability to recall, organize, and integrate ideas and the ability to express oneself in writing. Such outcomes require less structuring of responses than objective test items, and it is in the measurement of these outcomes that written essays are of great value. The distinctive feature of essay questions is that students are free to construct, relate, and present ideas in their own words. Learning outcomes concerned with the ability to conceptualize, construct, organize, relate, and evaluate ideas require the freedom of response and the originality provided by essay questions. Essay questions can be classified into two types: restricted response essay questions and extended response essay questions. Now let us briefly see these type of questions. Restricted response essay questions. These types of questions usually limit both the content and the response. The content is usually restricted by the scope of the topic to be discussed. Limitations on the form of response are generally indicated in the question. This can be demonstrated in the following example. In what ways are essay questions more preferable than objective test items? Answer in a brief paragraph. Extended response essays. These types of questions allow students to select any factual information that they think is relevant, to organize the answer in accordance with their best judgment, and to integrate and evaluate ideas as they deem appropriate. This freedom enables them to demonstrate their ability to analyze problems, organize their ideas, describe in their own words, and/or develop a coherent argument. In addition to the already described capacity in measuring higher-order thinking skills, essay questions have some more advantages, which include the following. Extended response essays focus on the integration and application of thinking and problem-solving skills. Essay assessments enable the direct evaluation of writing skills. Essay questions, as compared to objective tests, are easy to construct. Essay questions have a positive effect on students' learning. On the other hand, essay questions also have some limitations which you need to be aware of. Perhaps the most commonly cited problem of those test questions is their unreliability of scoring. Thus, the same paper may be scored differently by different teachers, and even the same teacher may give different scores for the same paper at different times. Another limitation is the amount of time required for scoring the responses. Still another problem with essay tests is the limited sampling of content they provide. There are some guidelines for improving the reliability and validity of essay scores. The following are suggestions for the construction of good essay questions. Restrict the use of essay questions to those learning outcomes that cannot be measured satisfactorily by objective items. As we have seen earlier, objective measures have the advantage of efficiency and reliability. When objective items are inadequate for measuring learning outcomes, however, the use of essay questions becomes necessary despite the limitations. Structure items so that the student's task is explicitly bounded. Phrase your essay items so that students will have no doubt about the response you're seeking. Don't hesitate to add details to eliminate ambiguity. For each question, specify the point value, an acceptable response length, and a recommended time allocation. What this second rule tries to do is give students the information they need to respond appropriately to an essay item. The less guessing that your students are obliged to do about how they're supposed to respond, the less likely it is that you will get lots of off-the-wall essays that don't give you the evidence you need. Employ more questions requiring shorter answers, rather than fewer questions requiring longer answers. This rule is intended to foster better content sampling in a test's essay items. With only 1 or 2 items on a test, chances are awfully good that your items may miss your students' areas of content mastery or non-mastery. Don't employ optional questions. When students are made to choose their essay items from several options, you really end up with different tests, unsuitable for comparison. Test a question's quality by creating a trial response to the item. A great way to determine if your essay items are really going to get at the responses you want is to actually try writing a response to the item, much as a student might do. 2.5.4 Constructing performance assessments. In the previous paragraphs you have been learning on how paper and pencil tests should be constructed. You have learned that well-constructed tests can measure a variety of learning outcomes, from simple to complex. Despite this wide applicability of paper and pencil tests, there remain many important learning outcomes that emphasize the actual performance of tasks in realistic settings, cannot be assessed using paper and pencil tests. Performance-based assessments are needed to check whether the desired learning outcomes are achieved up to the expected standards. For example, oral performance is required to assess a student's spoken communication skills in a certain language. Similarly, the use of mathematics to solve meaningful problems and to communicate solutions to others may also be best assessed by the use of performance tasks in realistic settings. Performance assessment is assessment based on observation and judgment. We look at a performance or product and make a judgment as to its quality. Examples include the following: complex performances such as playing a musical instrument, carrying out the steps in a scientific experiment, speaking a foreign language, reading aloud with fluency, or working productively in a group. In these cases it is the doing the process that is important. Creating complex products such as a term paper, a lab report, or a work of art. In these cases what counts is not so much the process of creation, although that may be evaluated too, but the level of quality of the product itself. As with extended written response assessments, performance assessments have 2 parts: a performance task or exercise and a scoring guide. Again, the scoring guide can award points for specific features of a performance or product that are present, or it can take the form of a rubric in which levels of quality are described. For example, to assess the ability to do a simple process, such as doing long division, points might be awarded for each step done in the correct order. Or, for more complex processes or products, you might have a rubric for judging quality that has several dimensions, such as ideas, organization, voice, word choice, sentence fluency and conventions in writing, or content, organization, presentation, and use of language in an oral presentation. Again, scores could be reported in number or percent of points earned, or in terms of a rubric score. A performance is any activity or product a student demonstrates or creates. Performances can be assessed usually with the aid of a rating rubric or scoring form. Performance assessments typically focus on demonstration of skills. Examples include constructed response written examination essays, sentence completion, products, oral examination or presentations, project individual team, written case study, portfolio, work product, student peer or self-evaluations. Performance assessments can be administered to individual students or groups of students. 2.6. Arrangement of test items. There are various methods of grouping items in an achievement test depending on their purposes. For most purposes, the items can be arranged by a systematic consideration of the type of items used, the learning outcomes measured, the difficulty of the items, and the subject matter measured. First, the items should be arranged in sections by item type. That is, all true-false items should be grouped together, then matching items, then all short answer or completion items, and then all multiple choice items. Extended response essay questions and performance tasks usually take a lot of time, but they would be administered alone. If combined with some of the other types of items and tasks, the extended response tasks should come last. Arranging the sections of a test in this order produces a sequence that roughly approximates the complexity of the outcomes measured, ranging from the simple to the complex. It is then merely a matter of grouping the items within each item type. For this purpose, items that measure similar outcomes should be placed together and then arranged in order of ascending difficulty. For example, the items under the multiple choice section might be arranged in the following order: knowledge of terms, knowledge of specific facts, knowledge of principles, and application of principles. Keeping together items that measure similar learning outcomes is especially helpful in determining the type of learning outcomes causing students the greatest difficulty. If, for any reason, it is not feasible to group the items by the learning outcomes measured, then it is still desirable to arrange them in order of increasing difficulty, beginning with the easiest items and proceeding gradually to the most difficult has a motivating effect on students. Also, encountering difficult items early in the test often causes students to spend a disproportionate amount of time on such items. If the test is long, they may be forced to omit later questions that they could easily have answered. With the items classified by item type, the sections of the test and the items within each section can be arranged in order of increasing difficulty. To summarize, the most effective method for organizing items in the typical classroom test is to 1. Form sections by item type. 2. Group the items within each section by the learning outcomes measured. And 3. Arrange both the sections and the items within sections in an ascending order of difficulty. Project work. In groups of 4, take one exam paper from the school you are placed for your practicum experience, which includes at least 3 types of test items. Then evaluate the items and the test in general based on the guidelines of test construction you have learned in the unit. You have to prepare and submit a report of your evaluation to your instructor. The test paper you have evaluated should also be attached with your report. 2.7. Administrating and scoring tests and reporting results. Test administration refers to the procedure of actually presenting the learning task that the examinees are required to perform in order to ascertain the degree of learning that has taken place during the teaching-learning process. This procedure is as important as the process of preparing the test. This is because the validity and reliability of test scores can be greatly reduced when test is poorly administered. While administering test, all examinees must be given fair chance to demonstrate their achievement of the learning outcomes being measured. This requires the provision of a physical and psychological environment which is conducive to their making their best efforts, and the control of such factors such as malpractices and unnecessary threat from test administrators that may interfere with valid measurement. It is also concerned with selecting convenient and accurate procedures for scoring the results. There are a number of conditions that may create test anxiety on students and therefore should be taken care of during test administration. These include threatening students with tests if they do not behave, warning students to do their best because the test is important, telling students they must work fast in order to finish on time, threatening dire consequences if they fail. 2.7.1 Ensuring quality in test administration. Quality and good control are necessary components of test administration. The following are guidelines and steps involved in test administration aimed at ensuring quality in test administration. Collection of the question papers in time from custodian to be able to start the test at the appropriate time stipulated. Ensure compliance with the stipulated sitting arrangements in the test to prevent collision between or among the test takers. Ensure orderly and proper distribution of questions papers to the test takers. Do not talk unnecessarily before the test. Test takers' time should not be wasted at the beginning of the test with unnecessary remarks, instructions, or threat that may develop test anxiety. It is necessary to remind the test takers of the need to avoid malpractices before they start and make it clear that cheating will be penalized. Stick to the instructions regarding the conduct of the test and avoid giving hints to test takers who ask about particular items, but make corrections or clarifications to the test takers whenever necessary. Keep interruptions during the test to a minimum. 2.7.2 Credibility and civility in test administration. Credibility and civility are aspects of characteristics of assessment which have day-to-day relevance for developing educational communities. Credibility deals with the value the eventual recipients and users of the results of assessment place on the result with respect to the grades obtained, certificates issued, or the issuing institution, while civility, on the other hand, inquires whether the persons being assessed are in such conditions as to give their best without hindrances and burdens in the attributes being assessed, and whether the exercise is seen as integral to or as external to the learning process. Hence, in test administration, effort should be made to see that the test takers are given a fair and unaided chance to demonstrate what they have learned with respect to instructions. Test should contain a set of instructions which are usually of two types. One is the instruction to the test administrator, while the other one is to the test taker. The instruction to the test administrator should explain how the test is to be administered, the arrangements to be made for proper administration of the test, and the handling of the scripts and other materials. The instructions to the administrator should be clear for effective compliance. For the test takers, the instruction should direct them on the amount of work to be done, or of tasks to be accomplished. The instruction should explain how the test should be performed. Examples may be used for illustration and to clarify the instruction on what should be done by the test takers. The language used for the instruction should be appropriate to the level of the test takers. The necessary administrators should explain the test taker's instruction for proper understanding, especially when the ability to understand and follow instructions is not part of the test. Duration of the test. The time for accomplishing the test is technically important in test administration and should be clearly stated for both the test administrators and test takers. Ample time should be provided for candidates to demonstrate what they know and what they can do. The duration of test should reflect the age and attention span of the test takers and the purpose of the test. Venue and sitting arrangement. The test environment should be learner-friendly with adequate physical conditions such as workspace, good and comfortable writing desks, proper lighting, good ventilation, moderate temperature, conveniences within reasonable distance, and serenity necessary for maximum concentration. It is important to provide enough and comfortable seats with adequate sitting arrangement for the test takers' comfort and to reduce collaboration between them. Adequate lighting, good ventilation and moderate temperature reduce test anxiety and loss of concentration, which invariably affects performance in the test. Noise is another undesirable factor that has to be adequately controlled both within and outside the test immediate environment, since it affects concentration and test scores. Other necessary conditions. Other necessary conditions include the fact that the questions and questions paper should be friendly with bold characters, neat, decent, clear and appealing, and not such that intimidates test taker into mistakes. All relevant materials for carrying out the demands of the test should be provided in reasonable number, quality and on time. All these are necessary to enhance the test administration and to make assessment civil in manifestation. On the other hand, for the credibility, effort should be made to moderate the test questions before administration based on laid-down standard. It is also important to ensure that valid questions are constructed based on procedures for test construction which you already have learned in the earlier sections of this unit. Secure custody should be provided for the questions from the point of drafting to constituting the final version of the test, to provision of security and safe custody of live scripts after the assessment, transmitting them to the graders, and provision of secure custody for the grades arising from the assessment against loss, mutilation, and alteration. The test administrators and the graders should be of proven moral integrity and should hold appropriate academic and professional qualifications. The test scripts are to be graded, and marks awarded strictly by using itemized marking schemes. All these are necessary because an assessment situation in which credibility is seriously called to question cannot really claim to be valid. 2.7.3 Scoring tests. In the evaluation of classroom learning outcomes, marking schemes are prepared alongside the construction of the test items in order to score the test objectively. The marking scheme describes how marks are to be distributed amongst the questions and between the various parts of the question. This distribution is dependent on the objective stated for the learning outcome during teaching, and the weight assigned to the questions during test preparation and construction of the test item. The marking scheme takes into consideration the facts required to answer the questions, and the extent to which the language used meets the requirement of the subject. Essay questions create some difficulty on teachers in scoring the answers, so that achievement is reliably measured than other types of tests. Therefore, some attention will be given here to the considerations you should make when scoring essay questions. As you are already aware, the construction and scoring of essay questions are interrelated processes that require attention if a valid and reliable measure of achievement is to be obtained. In the essay test, the examiner is an active part of the measurement instrument. Therefore, the variability within and between examiners affects the resulting score of examinee. This variability is a source of error which affects the reliability of essay test if not adequately controlled. Hence, for the essay test result to serve useful purposes, valid measurement instrument, conscious effort is made to score the test objectively by using appropriate methods to minimize the effort of personal biases on the resulting scores, and applying standards to ensure that only relevant factors indicated in the course objectives and called for during the test construction are considered during the scoring. There are two common methods of scoring essay questions. 1.The point or analytic method. In this method, each answer is compared with already prepared ideal marking schemes. Scoring and marks are assigned according to the adequacy of the answer. When used carefully, the analytic method provides a means for maintaining uniformity in scoring between scorers and between scripts, thus improving the reliability of the scoring. 2.The global/holistic of rating method. In this method, the examiner first sorts the response into 3 or more categories of varying quality based on his general or global impression on reading the responses. The standard of quality helps to establish a relative scale, which forms the basis for ranking responses from those with the poorest quality response to those that have the highest quality response. When the scorer is completely satisfied that each response is in its proper category, it is marked accordingly. As we have seen earlier, the most serious limitation with essay questions is related to scoring. Therefore, the following guidelines would be helpful in making the scoring of essay items easier and more reliable. 1. You should ensure that you are firm emotionally, mentally, etc. before scoring. 2. All responses to one item should be scored before moving to the next item. 3. Write out in advance a model answer to guide yourself in grading the student's answers. 4. Shuffle exam papers after scoring every question before moving to the next. 5. The names of test takers should not be known while scoring to avoid bias. 2.7.4 Reporting assessment results. The task of reporting students' progress cannot be separated from the procedures used in assessing students' learning. If educational objectives have been clearly defined in performance terms, and relevant tests and other assessment procedures have been properly used, grading and reporting become a matter of summarizing the results and presenting them in understandable form. School grades and progress reports serve various functions in the school. They provide information that is helpful to students, parents, and school personnel. Different reporting methods have been used in schools, including letter grades, numeric grades, the pass-fail system, checklist of objectives, portfolios of selected examples of student work, and parent-teacher conferences. Obviously, in our country's education system, we use numeric grades to report students' performance at secondary school level. This doesn't, however, mean that we should be limited to this reporting method. Depending on the purposes we want our report to serve, we can use a combination of 2 or more reporting methods. For example, we may give marks to summarize students' overall performance. At the same time, we may hold conferences with parents to report a qualitative description of students' progress in their learning. Thus, as prospective teachers, we are required to have skills of interpreting results to students, parents, or other lay audience. Such conference supplements the more formal written report of students' progress. Unit Summary. In this unit you were introduced to different types of assessment approaches, namely formal versus informal, criterion referenced versus norm referenced, formative versus summative assessments. You also learned about various assessment strategies. These include classroom presentations, exhibitions/demonstrations, conferences, interviews, observations, performance tasks, portfolios, question and answer, student self-assessment, checklists, rating scales and rubrics, 1-minute paper, muddy is point, students-generated questions and tests. You also learned about the challenges in the assessment of large classes and their consequences and some of the strategies that we can use to minimize those challenges. These strategies include front-ending, making use of in-class assignments, self and peer assessment, group assessment, changing the assessment method, or at least shortening it. Much of this unit was devoted to the construction of the widely assessment techniques, that is, tests. This was preceded by a discussion about the planning of tests. In this regard, tests were classified into 2 broad categories: objective tests and performance assessment essay tests. Objective tests were further divided into supply type items and selection type items. Supply type items include short answer and completion items, whereas selection type items include true/false items, matching items, and multiple choice items. Essay items were also classified into restricted essay items and extended essay items. Here you have learned about the strengths and limitations of these different test item types. You were also introduced to the major guidelines you should follow in constructing these test item types. This unit also covered about the arrangement of test item types. Finally, you also learned about the techniques and procedures we should follow during test administration. Self-check exercises. 1. State the differences between formative and summative assessment, criterion referenced and norm referenced assessment, and formal and informal assessment. 2. What conditions do we consider in selecting assessment strategies in our subject? 3. List down the major assessment strategies that you can use in your subject and classify them as formal and informal strategies. 4. What are the major problems associated with assessing students in large classes? What strategies can we use to minimize these problems? 5. What is a table of specification, and what major purposes does it serve? 6. What is the difference between objective tests and essay tests? 7. What are the advantages of objective tests as compared to essay tests? 8. What are the advantages of essay tests as compared to objective tests? 9. What are the major procedures we need to follow during test administration?